Here we go again. This podcast, we're going to focus on immigration and population, continuing right along our theme of this time period after the Civil War being a time of urbanization, immigration, industrialization, a time of expansion, a time of tension in the United States. With that in mind, let's go back and review what we've done the last couple of days with these podcasts and these maps. We started talking about the national recovery after the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the growth during this time period from 1865 to 1876, really. That's what this map depicts. Some of the things that we talked about that were important questions that you should think of here are what industry helped speed up this western migration of the population. You should be able to explain how Texas and cities like St. Louis and Chicago were linked during this time period. It's just good information to know when or where the oil industry started. And I guess just since we live in the area, what minerals were found in the Rocky Mountain states. So those are important questions to be able to answer based on this map. Next, we got into the agricultural aspect of this expansion, and we talked about farming and grazing. And really, to link this to the previous map, it is important to understand where the cotton belt is and the wheat belt and the corn belt is, and to understand that California and Arizona and Colorado need irrigation for their agricultural enterprises. But again, to link this map to the previous map, what do these production centers need? What do they require to be successful? And then next, we talked about minerals, we talked about manufacturing, and for this, it really is important for you all to understand what do the individual factories need in order to be successful. And along those same lines, and again, linking it to the two previous maps, what is the cornerstone of industrialism? So, that's kind of a review. Here's what we're doing today. We're talking about immigration and really the population explosion. Questions you should be able to answer based on this podcast are: what are the factors that have affected the assimilation of foreigners to the culture of the United States? Be able to explain, for the most part, where did the Irish, the Italians, the Russians, where did they settle in the United States? Along those same lines, where did the Germans and the Scandinavians settle? In 1790, where did most people live? And in what year did the urban population finally outnumber the rural? That's a tough word for me to say, rural population. And I'm going to ask you to make some predictions. If you own a railroad company during this time period after the Civil War, or into the early 1900s, would you be rich or poor? Pretty simple question. If you owned a steel mill, would you be rich or poor? There were lots of people that moved to the cities, either from the farm or from other countries. What are some of the things that these people might have had to compete for? What do you think the reaction was from the native workers towards the immigrants? When I say native workers, I mean the people that already lived in the United States, those people that already lived in the cities or had just migrated to the cities from the farm. That's what I mean by native workers, not referring back to Native Americans. And what do you think the reactions may have been from this group of workers towards the owner of the businesses? Where might there have been some conflict there? Again, standards we're focusing on, History 2A, determine and explain the historical context of the people and the events, and be able to explain the expansion of the United States from a geographic perspective. Here is our first map today. We'll have 3 maps that we're looking at today, and we really want to look at 2 things here. We want to look at the chart in the lower left-hand corner to start, focusing on immigration. The United States represents a blending of people, a unification of various cultures. When people immigrate to the United States, generally they are asked to assimilate, to adopt our culture, the culture of the United States. And there are 2 factors that really affect this whole process of assimilation throughout our history. One is that almost no immigrants would settle in the South. And this goes back to slavery. Free laborers did not want to compete with slave laborers. You really can't compete with slavery. You can't charge something when people are being forced to do it anyway. And the second factor as far as the assimilation of different cultures is the fact that the United States basically shut the doors, shut the gates around the year 1925. So since that time period, there have been fewer and fewer immigrants into the United States. I'm going to talk about some certain groups here. The British came in their greatest numbers from the years 1886 to 1890, and the Canadians were the greatest, had the greatest number of immigrants from 1921 to 1925. The Irish came in the greatest numbers from 1846 to 1866. It would be very interesting if you were able to look back at the group of Irish that came and why they were ultimately pushed out of Ireland to the United States. What are those push factors? But for the most part, they settled in New England and New Jersey, and really generally in all large cities. From 1901 to 1915, almost 3 million Italians came to America, and they tended to also settle in the larger cities and areas. The Russians, and a lot of the Russians were Jewish, they came in a lot like the Irish and the Italians, and they settled in larger cities. Some of them did move west and settle in the Dakotas, but for the most part they settled in big cities. The Germans kind of came in pretty steady numbers from 1846 until 1925, and their pattern of settlement is different. They kind of spread out all over the area, and they tended to move out into the farming areas. And the same can be said for the Scandinavians, those people from like Sweden and Norway and Denmark. They don't represent a large group of immigrants, and they tended to settle in the country areas, and again mostly through that Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Dakotas areas. Okay. Now at this point I want to actually focus on the map. The map, 1790. We're going back a little bit for the period we're covering, but the 3 maps I'm going to show you are in 50-year intervals, and they're at the time that the census was done to kind of gather all this information. This first map shows that the majority of the people lived along the coast or within a few miles of the coast. There were scattered settlements in the hilly and mountain sections of Pennsylvania and some of the southern states. Most of the country, however, was really unoccupied. Now this map, again, we're looking at two things here. We're looking at the map, which represents the year 1840, and we're looking at the chart in the lower left-hand corner. First of all, let's look at this map. First, notice that the country has really increased in size and in population, and the centers of dense population are in Ohio and Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The darker areas on the map are where more people live. So again, those centers of populations have begun to spread out. I want to focus on the chart a little bit more and talk about the difference between the rural population and the urban population. Traditionally, we were a country, an agrarian country, and in 1800 there was only 6% of the population that actually lived in the cities. And each decade, however, there were more and more people moving towards the cities. By 1920, it's the first time that really the urban population was greater than the rural population. And 1890. This map shows just incredible growth, enormous growth. The people have scattered, cities have grown larger. There's actually some centers of growth of really bigger populations throughout the West. You know, it's scattered more, but you can see Denver and San Francisco, Los Angeles in that area. Again, now let's focus on the total population chart towards the bottom left of the graph. What this shows is African American born population, again what we called native population, people who were born in the United States, and the orange figures are immigrants, foreign born members of the population. And so again, the population is steadily increasing, and this is in groups of 20. You'll notice that from 1920 down to 1940, the number of foreign born, those orange figures, actually decreases a little bit. And again, I commented that around the year 1925, the United States really stopped allowing open migration. We really kind of shut down the doors. Anyway, that is our little lesson about immigration and population. Again, I want you to think about some things and be ready to make some predictions. As I've stated before, I borrowed these maps. I've borrowed it from Edgar Wesley in Our United States History and Maps. Again, you should be able to explain some key people and events, and you should be able to interpret the expansion of the United States from a geographic perspective. His Macadociousness Incorporated.